Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for June 15th, 2021. I'm going to try and get through this update without sneezing too much, but there has been a proliferation of tree pollen here in Germany, which I'm assuming NATO intelligence will discover was sent here by Vladimir Putin. Which brings me to the saying from Sophocles, the Greek dramatist, who in the tragedy of Antigone wrote, "Whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad." This describes accurately the deliberations going on between the G7 summit, which concluded over the weekend, and then the NATO summit, which concluded yesterday. The best way to characterize the NATO summit, I think, is from a comment issued by the Chinese embassy in London, which issued a statement saying, quote, "The days when global decisions were dictated by a small group of countries are long gone." This is a reference to the constant point being made about the rules-based order, Western liberal democracies, our values, and so on. Points made by Biden and his Secretary of State Blinken, by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but also by virtually everyone participating in the summits. The idea that there are rules that everyone should adhere to, and those who don't are troublemakers, are malign influences on the world, and have to be opposed vigorously through punitive sanctions and possibly military action if they continue this. Now, when you hear what I'm going to report from these summits, you'll see that this is absolutely absurd because most of these allegations are evidence-free. If you look at the succession of events from the beginning of the 21st century, starting with the post-9/11 attacks on Iraq based on the fake story of weapons of mass destruction, the constant stories about use of chemical weapons against Russia's enemies by the Syrian government, these assertions of cyber attacks and so on that continue nonstop. There's no evidence to back them, as we saw when Robert Mueller spent millions of dollars and years investigating the charges of Russian meddling and could come up with nothing. And in fact, it was admitted in testimony by the head of the cyber firm that was supposedly protecting the Democratic Party that they had no evidence of Russian hacking of the computers, and yet we hear every single day Russia hacked. They hacked the elections in 2016. They hacked the elections in 2020, and on and on and on. So this idea of the rules-based order being threatened by Russia and China, let's look at what they agreed on in these various summits. First, the G7 put forward Build Back Better Worldwide, a clean green initiative supposedly to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It will do nothing of the sort. They're putting no money into real infrastructure. If anything, they're buying up the rights of developing sector countries to develop by saying, if you don't develop, we'll give you some cash from a pool here so that we can continue to produce carbon footprints. When in fact, it's all based on fake science, as we'll demonstrate at the second panel of our conference on June 26th. Now, they also supposedly were going to distribute vaccines, but the pledges that were made were little more than what they had made previously. And the idea that they'll somehow get whole sections of the world vaccinated by the end of 2022, by then we'll probably have a COVID-22 that we'll have to deal with if they don't step up production and distribution. So very little was done, a lot of hoopla about it, but not much of content. The other major issue that came out was the confrontation of Russia and China. Let me first say why these things won't work. One, there's a global economic crisis, a bubble that's about to pop, a debt bubble which includes corporate debt, private debt, it includes government debt, it includes mortgage debt, car loan debt, student debt. This is something which is being treated with a free flow of funny money, which is now producing inflation heading toward hyperinflation. None of that was discussed at all at the summit. Secondly, the Green New Deal is slogans but no substance. It's fake science. It's not going to do a thing to aid development, which requires increasing the energy flux density of electric power systems, not reducing it. And finally, the idea that Russia and China are the enemies of the West. Russia and China are sovereign nation states which are committed to the development of their countries, as well as cooperative efforts with their neighbors and other countries. They see little benefit to them to go along with the so-called rules-based order, which is dictated by the monetary and financial needs, desperate needs, of the City of London, Wall Street, and the European Union financial networks. Why should they sabotage their economic development so the billionaires of Davos can increase their profits at the expense of the world? So that's the background to why this won't work and why it's crazy. But here are some of the specifics that they said. Biden in Brussels, after his meeting with NATO, said Russia and China are both seeking to drive a wedge in our transatlantic solidarity, but NATO is rock solid and unshakable. Well, how are Russia and China doing this? Well, supposedly cyber attacks, military aggression, and so on. You'll see more as it goes on. But the NATO communique issued yesterday stated that until Russia demonstrates compliance with international law and its international obligations and responsibilities, there can be no return to business as usual. Well, what's business as usual? We've been violating treaties in the West. The agreement that was made to Gorbachev that once the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, NATO would not move eastward, that's been violated repeatedly. Then they go on to say China is presenting systemic challenges for NATO. Doing what? Building infrastructure? Helping countries develop modern platforms of infrastructure, power plants, high-speed rail, ports, and so on? The West has military bases all over the world. I should say the United States does. China does not. Who's threatening the order? They expressed concern over Moscow and Beijing holding joint military exercises. What about Defender Europe 21, where all of NATO forces are moving back and forth to the borders of Russia in Eastern Europe? Is that not a concern for Russia? Now, they go on to say that Russia continues to breach the values, principles, trust, and commitments outlined in documents defining the Russia-NATO relationship. As I've mentioned to you, the agreement to not move NATO eastward has been repeatedly violated by the West. The idea that Russia did something illegal in Crimea, where they did have a referendum with an over 80% vote for the return of Crimea to Russia. And this was largely due to the fact that the government that came to power in an illegal coup in Ukraine in February 2014, under the direction of Biden, Victoria Nuland, and the Obama administration, that coup, the government that came in, threatened ethnic Russians living in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. So the idea that it was illegal for that to be annexed back to Russia, when the people who lived there were frightened by the policies of the Nazis and the security forces of Ukraine, that's an absurdity. And who is it that's not abiding by the Minsk agreements? It's Ukraine and the West. So the idea that there's a deteriorating security environment caused by Russia is absurd. But they pledge to enhance our deterrence and defense posture, including by a forward presence in the eastern part of the alliance. So they're saying that they're going to continue to move east. NATO will continue to move east. They're also discussing an Asian NATO built around the so-called Quad, but also with British and German and other forces moving into the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific region. Then they go in a laundry list of accusations against Russia. Interference in elections. Well, that's what the United States has done in Russia repeatedly. Political and economic pressure and intimidation. What about the U.S. insistence that the IMF austerity policies be the conditions for any aid to countries in the former colonial world, which means they're getting no aid? Disinformation campaigns. Well, what about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which came from the British and the Bush administration? Malicious cyber activities. Well, what about the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program with cyber activities? Turning a blind eye to cyber criminals, etc., etc., etc. Now, Putin was asked by an interviewer on NBC about this. The interviewer said, there is a weight of evidence of alleged state-sponsored cyber attacks. Are you waging a cyber war against America? And Putin responded simply, where is the evidence? Where is the proof? Isn't evidence and proof part of the so-called Western value system? Well, apparently not when it comes to expanding the empire based on the City of London and Wall Street. The commitment to this global transformation to a central banker dictatorship which does not tolerate any nation which won't submit to its anti-sovereign demands. So this is absurd. And you see that the Sophocles' statement about the gods first driving those people who are pushing these policies mad, well, that's an accurate description. What's needed is serious deliberation, is dialogue. But it's not going to come from these venues. Now, tomorrow, Biden and Putin will be meeting in Geneva. Hopefully, they'll have a discussion. Biden now says he's going to draw red lines. I assume he's going to have a napkin there and a red Bic pen and start drawing red lines on the napkin. Instead, there should be serious discussion about collaboration to attack the COVID pandemic, to reconstruct Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the nations that have been destroyed by these endless wars, to restore the nuclear arms agreements, and to actually discuss how to get the world out from under this debt bomb that's about to explode. That would be useful. And that's what we'll be discussing at the Schiller Institute online conference on June 26th and 27th. Go to our website, schillerinstitute.com, and register for that, because if you want to see serious deliberation, that's where you have to go. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow.